I would like to talk to you about statistical analysis for your project. In this video, I'm going to show you how to calculate some of the summary statistics you need to answer research questions. We will use pivot tables to calculate these summary statistics, and then I will demonstrate how you can put those summary statistics into your statistical calculator, the Excel sheet that I created for you. I have two research questions in mind. My one sample research question is going to be to estimate the GPA, the average GPA of Filipino students at Fremont High School. And my two sample research question will be to test the claim that the proportion of Sunnyvale students whose parents earned a high school diploma is different than Columbia's students and the students who came from Columbia Middle School. For these research questions, I have selected simple random samples of size 100 for each sample that we need to choose. For research question 1, I want to estimate the average GPA of Filipino students at Fremont High School. Let's turn to our Excel sheet. This is our familiar Excel sheet. You saw in the previous video that I chose simple random samples of Columbia students and Sunnyvale students. I have added a simple random sample of Filipino students from Fremont High School. What I'd like to do is compute the average GPA. I will also need the standard deviation, the sample standard deviation for this sample. So for the GPA for this sample. So in order to do this, there's a number of ways that we could do this in Excel. We could use an Excel formula, which you have seen last semester. But I want to show you something else because this will help with our two sample analysis as well. I'm going to go to Insert. I am going to highlight my entire sample. Notice there's 101 rows, so there's 100 students in my sample. I'm going to insert a pivot table. The pivot table the pivot table will look at the data that we highlighted. It's in these cells here. I'd like to put a landing page for this table. It's literally a table that Excel will create. And I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to choose, say, column K right there. And I just like to start this off in cell maybe row 3, K3. Now, if I scroll back to the top, you'll see that a form for a pivot table has been created. Now, we only have our Filipino students, and we'd like to find the average GPA. I'd also like to find the standard deviation of the GPAs among these 100 students. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on this GPA and hold my mouse button and drag GPA down to this sum values. This is for summary values. Right now it has the total GPA in it, but what I can do is go to the value of the field. And actually, I'd like to count the GPAs in this data because that will be my sample size. Now, I can select this again drag, and you see another result, another summary statistic has popped up, and my table has changed right here. I don't want the sum of the GPA. Let's find the average of the GPAs. And then I'd like to find the standard deviation, so I'll drop GPA in again. And I want to find, let's look for, well, first of all, try this out yourself and look at the list of summary statistics. But in this case, we want the standard deviation. Standard dev P is the population standard deviation. We want the sample standard deviation. And now I have a table that contains the sample size, how many GPAs are in my list, the average of my GPAs, and the standard deviation of the GPAs. sample standard deviation. Let's go to our statistical calculator. I uploaded this onto Canvas, so you should be able to find this here. I have my one sample proportions. Oh, we're looking for average. We have one sample mean. And here are the summary statistics for some other system. Let's see, I'd like to copy the summary statistics that we have here. I have them in the wrong order. Let's see, let's flip back here and let's go to view. What I can do here is go to arrange all and let's arrange vertical. What this is going to do is it's going to put my two Excel sheets side by side. I think we'll X this box out. I can show you how to get that back later. Now, if we scroll over to our pivot table, we have count. I can type in my 100. My average GPA, that's a little long. I mean, we could copy that in. But what if we hit Control C? Let's right click. And remember the different paste functions? Let's just paste as values. And that's just going to change my value to this number here. And I can do the same thing with the standard deviation. That way I don't have to worry about how many decimal places I'm copying in or copying correctly. I can paste as values. Now, our research question is that we want to estimate the average GPA. So when we estimate, we're going to use a confidence interval. And so we need to choose a confidence level. The request didn't have a specific confidence level in mind. So we could go with a 95% confidence interval. We could go with a 90% confidence interval. We could go with a 99 or 99.9% confidence interval. Oh, that did round up to 1, but you can see it's not 0.999. And so you can choose what confidence level you want and put that in. And we've got our standard error, our margin of error, our lower and upper limits. For our confidence interval, we're 95% confident that the average GPA for Filipino students is between 2.92 and 3.17, say, just rounding to 2 decimal places. So that is research question 1, and you can take that information and type it up. Research question 2, we want to test the claim that the proportion of Sunnyvale students whose parents earned a high school diploma is different than Columbia students. For this, in fact, let's look at the statistical calculator. We will need to determine, let's see, this is a 2-sample proportions. We need to determine the number of successes and the sample size for each of our 2 samples, for our Sunnyvale students and our Columbia students. So, let's go back to our data table. When I selected my samples, I took Columbia students, I took Sunnyvale students, and then I pooled those together. Now, let's take our 200 students that we've sampled here and insert a pivot table. Again, I want to set it aside from my data, but I can put it in, say, K3. Scrolling back up, we've got the bones of a pivot table. Now, what I want to know is we said Columbia and Sunnyvale students. Let's go to the feeder middle school. I'm going to put the feeder middle school in the rows. Now, I can count my students. Let's just put their code number in, but I don't want the total of the code number. Let's make that counts. Okay, So we got 100 Columbia students and 100 Sunnyvale students. But you know what? I need to know how many of them have parents whose highest level of education is exactly a high school GPA. I'm going to drop the parent education level into columns. And what this does is it creates a two-way table for me. A two-way table to compare education level in the columns. And actually, you know what? Let's flip these. Let's put the parents' education level in the columns. That's going to be easier to read. Okay. So I've got Columbia students, Sunnyvale students. And I'm really just interested in the high school GPA. So there are 100 Columbia students, 100 Sunnyvale students. 16 of the Sunnyvale students had parents whose education level stopped at high school graduation as a high school diploma. And 25 of the Columbia students had them. So now we can view vertical. And let's look at the two sample proportions. Now I have to decide who's sample 1 and who is sample 2. I think alphabetically we'll make Columbia sample 1 and Sunnyvale sample 2. So I can even write this Columbia and Sunnyvale. So we had 100 Columbia students, and we also had 100 Sunnyvale students. We had 25 Columbia students whose parents got a high school GPA, a high school graduation, but not college, didn't go to college. And we had 16 Sunnyvale students. We've got a sample difference of 9 percentage points. Now we want to test the claim. So we can go to the hypothesis test portion of our two sample proportions, hypothesis test area. And there's nothing to put in here. We've got our sample data. We've got our pooled sample. We've got the estimated standard error from the pooled sample. And you've got the p-value of your choice. You need to decide on what your hypothesis test is. What is your alternative hypothesis? We've got the test statistic here. So, this is how you can do a two sample proportions. You will need to adapt if you want to do, say, a one sample mean or a two sample mean. You can ask me questions if you would like to know if that's what you're trying to do. So, we have gone over how to calculate summary statistics using p-values and enter that data into a statistical calculator.